London, on the eve of spring in 1814, carried the scent of wet stone and horse-drawn carriages, a mingling of grit and elegance that mirrored the contradictions of its society. Lanterns glimmered through a thin veil of rain, softening the harsh corners of the city and blurring the boundaries between shadow and light. For Lady Eleanor Ashford, returning to the capital after a year of silence felt like stepping into a world half-remembered yet painfully familiar. The carriages, the voices, the clipped laughter spilling through the doors of grand houses. All of it stirred echoes of the life she once inhabited with a naive heart and a belief in promises made too easily. Her family townhouse, though modest by aristocratic measure, stood polished and awaiting her return. Servants bowed, but she felt the distance that had grown between herself and everything she had known. The past year had altered her, carved new lines of strength into her spirit, even as it left tender seams of doubt. She had come back not as the hopeful debutante she once was, but as a woman who had survived humiliation, heartbreak, and the quiet burden of a secret no one must yet learn. Almac's assembly rooms loomed at the end of the street like a citadel of polished glass and unforgiving judgment. Their white facade gleamed beneath the lanterns, a beacon for the fashionable elite who traded in alliances, whispers, and careful cruelties. Eleanor paused before the entrance, drawing a slow breath as the coachman opened the door. She descended with grace she had practiced in solitude, the kind that hid trembling hands and a heart that beat too quickly. Inside, the ballroom unfolded like a blooming rose of candlelight and polished gold. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, scattering firelight across silk gowns, mirrored walls, and faces powdered to porcelain perfection. Music drifted through the air, an elegant waltz that carried as much expectation as melody. Fans fluttered like restless birds, conversations rose and fell in curated waves, and every eye seemed to flick toward the doorway where Eleanor now stood. Whispers traveled faster than any carriage. "Is that her? The Ashford girl? She vanished after Harrington broke it off. Poor thing. She looks thinner, though still pretty enough, I suppose." Eleanor lifted her chin, determined not to falter. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, preparing herself for the sting of returned scrutiny, for the way society remembered only scandal and forgot the quiet suffering that followed. She glided into the room with measured steps, her pale blue gown brushing against the gleaming floor, her silver gloves clasping tightly at her sides. She knew she must endure. She had come here to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she would not be defined by the cruel end of a promise broken in the most public fashion. But as she moved through the crowd, offering polite nods and carefully measured smiles, she felt the familiar weight of isolation settle around her. No one approached. No one dared to speak beyond a cautious greeting. She was a relic of disgrace, a reminder of how swiftly reputation could crumble. Then a voice she once knew intimately broke through the hum of conversation. "Eleanor, I hardly recognized you." Viscount Nathaniel Harrington stood a few paces away, dressed impeccably, confidence radiating from him like heat from a fire. His smile bore the softness of old acquaintance, but his eyes glittered with a cruel amusement that sent a cold line down her spine. He had not changed. His beauty remained polished, his charm intact, and his arrogance sharpened to a fine edge. "Lord Harrington," she replied with a calm she did not feel. "Good evening to you." He stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back in a posture of casual superiority. "I must say, I did not expect to see you here. After everything, I believed you would choose quieter settings." His voice lowered just enough that nearby guests might still hear. "Tell me, Eleanor, no husband yet?" The word struck like a whip, sharp, humiliating, and delivered with deliberate precision. A few guests stilled, their gazes drifting toward her with renewed interest. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to retreat or provide him the satisfaction of flinching. "My circumstances are no longer any of your concern, my lord," she answered softly, firmly. He chuckled, tilting his head. "Ah, still spirited. I remember that well." His gaze swept over her, lingering just long enough to suggest condescension. "One hopes you find your match soon, before time renders the search difficult." The room seemed to press in around her, every whisper magnified. Eleanor's breath tightened in her chest, but she held her ground. It was not simply pride that anchored her. It was the knowledge that Harrington, in all his pettiness, knew nothing of the truth she bore. Her life had changed since he shattered it. Her future was no longer his to mock. Beyond Harrington's shoulder, a figure stood in the shadow of a marble column, immobile, watchful, unmistakably composed. Eleanor felt her pulse shift, not with alarm, but with a deep, unspoken gravity. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the severe black favored by statesmen, Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravensborough, observed the exchange with unreadable intensity. His presence altered the air. Even from across the room, his gaze held hers with a steadiness that threatened to unravel her fear entirely. Their eyes met, and in that brief connection, something like reassurance flickered between them, quiet, restrained, undeniable. Harrington continued to speak, though she no longer heard him. Her attention had been claimed by the man who knew her far more deeply than her former suitor ever had. The Duke's expression was a mask of control, but there was tension in the line of his jaw. A storm gathered behind his composed facade. Eleanor drew a breath, summoned a polite smile, and stepped back from Harrington. "Good evening, my lord," she said, ending the conversation with a dignity she refused to relinquish. As she turned away, the Duke separated himself from the column and began crossing the ballroom toward her. Guests whispered and parted in his path, for his influence reached far beyond the glittering floor of Almack's. He was power incarnate, a man whose decisions shifted the balance of English politics. Eleanor's heart beat once, twice, like a whispered question. She did not know whether he would acknowledge her openly, whether he was prepared to stand beside her before the eyes of all London. Yet the look in his eyes as he approached suggested a decision had already been made, one that might alter the course of both their lives. And as the room seemed to hold its breath, Eleanor realized she was no longer afraid. The Duke of Ravensborough reached Eleanor with a measured stride, one that neither hurried nor hesitated, yet carried a gravity that shifted the very air around him. Conversation softened as though society itself leaned closer, curious, unsettled, and quietly electrified by his deliberate path toward a woman many believed had fallen from favor. Eleanor felt the trembling in her fingertips beneath her gloves, but kept her posture serene. She had learned long ago that dignity was her most powerful armor. "Lady Eleanor," the Duke said softly, bowing his head just enough to acknowledge her without provoking scandal. His voice, deep and tempered like polished steel, carried a warmth few ever heard. "You are far from the country. I confess, I had not expected your return so soon." She curtsied, her gaze lowered only for an instant. "Your Grace," the season began. "I thought it prudent to face what must be faced." His eyes, a storm-gray hue that had unsettled half the House of Lords and silenced the other half, softened as they studied her. What occurred moments ago, Harrington's impertinence, was intolerable. "I should have intervened." "You should not," she said quickly, surprising even herself with the firmness of her tone. "If you had, tongues would wag before the hour's end. I am already the subject of too much gossip." He regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are my wife," he murmured, voice pitched low so only she could hear. Their whispers should mean nothing compared to that truth. A quiet shiver passed through her. Their marriage, though true in law, remained a closely guarded secret, an arrangement forged in the ashes of her ruined reputation, meant to protect her family's name and provide him with a partner of unimpeachable character for his political ambitions. Yet in the months since the vows were quietly spoken, a strange and fragile bond had begun to grow between them. Something unspoken, delicate, almost dangerous. "I thank you, Alexander," she whispered, allowing his given name for the briefest heartbeat. "But tonight, we must be cautious." He inclined his head, accepting her reasoning even as frustration flickered in his eyes. "Very well," he said. "But know that I do not take kindly to seeing you wounded." "Nor do I," she replied with a faint smile, "to being wounded." A brief silence lingered, gentle, intimate, sharpened by the awareness that society's eyes were everywhere. The Duke stepped aside just enough to offer her the crook of his arm without making the gesture appear inappropriate. "Allow me, then, to offer you a moment's respite." She hesitated only because of the stares she felt prickling across the room. But his presence beside her, calm and protective without being possessive, steadied her. She placed her hand lightly upon his arm, and that single contact, glove against tailored sleeve, felt like the first breath after long suffocation. They moved through the ballroom with a quiet grace, their pace unhurried yet commanding. The whispers rose in their wake. Is she acquainted with him? Surely not. The Duke never escorts anyone. Perhaps he merely shows pity. Or perhaps... The murmurs dissolved into speculation Eleanor dared not absorb. He guided her toward the edge of the room, where the candlelight softened and footmen kept a respectful distance. "Tell me honestly," he began, his tone gentler than she remembered. "Did his words cause you pain?" "Harrington cannot wound me further than he already has," she replied. "I know what he is. I know what he values." A pause, then more quietly, "I am no longer that girl he abandoned." The Duke's gaze deepened, studying her as though reshaping his understanding. "No," he said, "you are not." Something in his voice, admiration perhaps, made her breath catch. A passing couple drifted too close, forcing the Duke to shift slightly, angling his body between Eleanor and the curious onlookers. It was a subtle gesture, protective yet unobtrusive, and warmth spread through her chest before she could restrain it. She had never imagined that the man who stood before her, distant, formidable, a master of political restraint, could display such instinctive gentleness. "Your return has unsettled them," he said calmly. "For a year, society has shaped your absence into its own narrative. Now you stand before them unchanged, and entirely changed. They do not know which story to believe." "Let them wonder," she replied. "Rumor is nothing new." "Perhaps not." His eyes lowered briefly to her lips before returning to her gaze with perfect composure. "But I would spare you even a moment of it, if I could." His words stirred a warmth she had tried hard to guard against. Their marriage might have begun as necessity, but moments like this, quiet, sincere, stripped of the world's gaze, made her question whether the boundaries between duty and desire were as solid as she once believed. A footman approached discreetly, offering a silver tray with a folded ivory note addressed in elegant handwriting, to Lady Eleanor Ashford. She accepted it with a polite nod, though confusion tightened her brow. When she opened it, her breath caught. The note contained only a single sentence. Asterisk, "I know what you are hiding." Asterisk. Her heart lurched. The Duke's gaze sharpened, reading her expression in an instant. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. She handed him the card. His jaw hardened as he read it, eyes narrowing with a fury he rarely displayed. "Who sent this?" "I do not know," she whispered. "But someone suspects something." His posture straightened, his entire presence shifting into the controlled power that had earned him half the nation's fear and the crown's deepest trust. "This cannot be ignored," he said. "We must discover the author, and their intentions." Eleanor's pulse quickened. If their secret were exposed, if society learned she was no longer merely the disgraced young woman returned from obscurity but the Duchess of Ravensborough, scandal would erupt like a storm across England. His political alliances would tremble. Her family would face scrutiny anew, and the fragile, burgeoning intimacy between them could be shattered by the very world they sought to navigate with caution. Yet when she looked up at him, she saw no hesitation. Only determination. "You will not face this alone," the Duke said quietly, offering his arm once more. "Not tonight. Not ever." She placed her hand in his, the gesture small yet monumental, and allowed him to lead her away from prying eyes. As they retreated from the ballroom's glittering spectacle, Eleanor felt a subtle shift within her, fear mingling with something dangerously close to hope. And for the first time that evening, the possibility that their secret might become something far more than obligation began to take root. The carriage moved slowly through the lamplit streets, its wheels cutting a muted rhythm against the cobblestones as Eleanor sat opposite the Duke, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She had not spoken since they left Almack's. The note lay concealed in her reticule like a live coal, threatening to burn through the silk at any moment. In the dim interior, illuminated only by the flicker of passing lanterns, Alexander watched her with a steady patience that made her heart twist. He did not press her, did not demand she speak before she was ready. He merely waited, a fortress of quiet strength, until her thoughts settled enough to be voiced. "It is not the message itself that frightens me," she said at last, her voice barely louder than the rustle of her gown. "It is the implication." Someone saw more than they should have. Someone suspects what we have hidden so carefully. His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. No secret is impenetrable, Eleanor. But we will face whatever comes with clarity, not fear. He leaned forward slightly, the gesture subtle yet deeply grounding. Tell me truly, do you regret returning tonight? She hesitated, recalling Harrington's smirk, the whispers, the cold weight of that mysterious note. But she also remembered the Duke's protective stance, the way his presence had steadied her, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name. No, she said eventually. If I hide any longer, I become the woman they claimed I was, broken, disgraced, unworthy of being seen. I will not surrender to that ghost. A flicker of approval lit his expression. Then we proceed with honesty between us, if nowhere else. He paused, choosing his next words with the same deliberation he used in Parliament. Tell me what weighs on you most. Eleanor lowered her eyes for a moment before lifting them again with quiet resolve. I fear becoming a burden to you. This marriage, our secrecy, was meant to shield our families from shame. But if our truth is dragged into the light, you will suffer far more than I. Alexander's reply was immediate, his tone firm without harshness. Do not speak of yourself as a weight I must bear. I entered our marriage with full knowledge of the consequences. I have never once regretted it. He paused, then added with a gentler cadence, and I do not think you understand how greatly I value your presence in my life. Her breath stilled. In all their months of marriage, meals shared with practiced civility, letters exchanged when duty kept him away, moments of unexpected tenderness that neither dared name, he had never spoken so plainly. The air between them shifted, growing warmer, more fragile. Alexander, she began, then faltered, for words seemed suddenly insufficient. The carriage slowed as they neared the steps of Ravensborough House, its grand facade glowing beneath the gas lamps. Before she could gather her next thought, the Duke stepped out and offered his hand. She took it, feeling the strength and steadiness of his grip as he guided her inside. Footmen bowed silently as they passed through the foyer, aware that the late hour demanded discretion. When they reached the privacy of the crimson drawing-room, he dismissed the servants with a single nod. The door closed behind them, leaving only the crackle of the hearth and the faint scent of rain drifting in from the street. Eleanor stood near the mantelpiece, heat warming her chilled fingers, while Alexander remained a respectful distance away, though every line of his posture suggested he wished to bridge it. Let us examine what we know, he said calmly. Someone watched us, perhaps at Almack's, perhaps in the weeks before. Whoever wrote the note believes you conceal something of significance. But they do not know what that something is. Not yet. Why now? She whispered. Why tonight, after a year of silence? Because you returned, he replied. Because the moment you stepped into the ballroom, society awoke. And whoever wrote that note, whether out of spite or ambition, saw an opportunity. The firelight cast shifting patterns across his face, revealing the shadows of concern beneath his composed exterior. Eleanor stepped closer, compelled by instinct rather than reason. Alexander, she said softly, I must ask you something. If our secret is exposed, if the world learns that we married quietly, without fanfare, would you resent me for the consequences you must bear? His expression changed, slowly and profoundly. He took a step toward her, then another, until her reflection trembled in his darkened eyes. Resent you? He repeated, voice low with disbelief. Eleanor, I have endured years of political battles, endless scrutiny, alliances forged and broken. Yet none of those trials have troubled me half as much as the thought of you believing yourself a burden. He lifted a hand but stopped just short of touching her cheek, restrained by that last thread of propriety. You are my wife. Not by accident. Not by obligation. And certainly not by regret. Her breath trembled at the intensity of his words. She had never imagined he felt so deeply, not this man whose control was legendary, whose reputation left earls trembling. And yet here he stood, offering her a truth that felt more intimate than any embrace. I do not wish to hide you, he continued softly. I never have. But I honored your fear, your pain. Your need for time. If exposure comes, let it come. I will not step aside. I will not distance myself. I will claim you before all of London. Her pulse hammered, the echo of 1,000 unspoken hopes rising from the quiet corners of her heart. Slowly, she reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, a gesture so gentle it felt like a vow. Then I must offer you honesty as well, she whispered. I am not afraid of being known as your wife. I am afraid of wanting more than I should. His breath caught, soft, unsteady, utterly human. And what is it you want, Eleanor? She stepped closer, her fingertips brushing down to rest against his jaw. To be chosen, she said. Not for convenience or protection, but because I matter to you. Emotion flickered in his eyes, raw, unguarded, unmistakably real. You do, he said simply, the words falling between them like a promise sealed in the dark. Before either could speak again, footsteps echoed in the hall, quick, urgent, stopping directly outside the door. A knock followed, sharp enough to pierce the fragile intimacy they had woven. Alexander's expression hardened. Enter, he commanded. A breathless footman appeared. Your Grace, a second note has arrived. Eleanor's heart stilled. The Duke accepted the sealed envelope, and as the fire crackled behind them, he broke the wax with a deliberate hand. This time, the message held only 3 words. Asterisk, I saw everything. Asterisk. Eleanor gasped softly. Alexander lifted his gaze to her, his expression turning to steel. Their secret was no longer merely suspected. It was being watched.